Good.
All right, so you ready to go?
I am.
Hang on just a quick second. Cool, so let's welcome Stuart talking about Electron and TypeScript.
So I am a TypeScript developer. I do a lot of enterprise application development, often involving the full stack, all the way from server API to the desktop. And something I'm a .NET developer as well, and something I like about TypeScript is that it's strongly typed. And I do a lot of C# development in .NET, and that's strongly typed as well. So what I want to present to you today is the ability to write web applications in a language that gives you contracts and types to work with, and also kind of how to integrate that into the desktop using Electron, which gives you the ability to write desktop applications across platforms in one language. So why use Electron? Well, it's cross-platform development. You can essentially be a polyglot developer, whether it's C#, Python, Node, or whatever, and even C++. Released for X platforms. Today you can write .NET Core apps and JavaScript desktop applications that can run on multiple platforms, which is a benefit. And we're getting closer to the future where you can run multiple languages, be used for development. For example, if you want to code in JS and .NET and still deploy in Linux or Mac, you can do that with this type of architecture. So if you've got like a Python or .NET app you need to communicate with and you want this desktop application, you could do that with Electron, where you wouldn't be able to do that with a web browser, right? This is really useful if you want to bring legacy functionality into a modern environment, where you've got some old stuff you want to communicate with that's in another process. You could do something called inter-process communication in Electron. And in TypeScript, you can also, because TypeScript is JavaScript with types, you can now kind of strongly type things and have a better contract between processes, right? So Electron, one of the else benefits of going with Electron is it gives you a consistent, stable Chrome API. You don't have to worry about browser inconsistencies or dealing with IE or Edge. It's all Chrome. In my opinion, Chrome is the best browser out there. So you get the Chrome runtime, but you also get the Node runtime, all packed in one. You're able to access. You can work with binary streams, do inter-process communication, everything that Node gives you, access to the file system and stuff, you can do inside of a web application on the desktop, right? So why TypeScript? Well, Electron uses event-based communication between the main and render process, right? So there's two processes, main and render, in Electron, where a typical web application has one thread. Here, you have the concept of the main and render process and the ability to communicate between those two. Something called IPC, which is an inter-process communication. Data crosses the process boundary. So you have like this publisher to subscriber pattern going on there, and you could use an interface to write a contract between those two. So if you think of it like a pub-sub model, right? Let's say you scale out to like hundreds of events. How do you make sure that team Y is writing methods to be able to communicate with team Z? We've got a ton of events going around, and making sure that those contracts stay together, even between processes, even if it's another language, right? So you can use interfaces for that. You can even generate those interfaces if you want to. So like this is like a basic message pump right here. You've got stuff that happens on the Electron render process, you want to request data, so you fire off an event, and you have the Electron main thread listening for that event. And it's just kind of pumping that data all the way down, different processes, and even down to, let's say you have a .NET legacy executable, right? So that some guy wrote like 20 years ago, and you want to hook that up to an Electron app. You can do that with this pub/sub model. And you can strongly type it by, let's say my C# application has a method that accepts 3 arguments. You can write a C# interface for that. And you can write a TypeScript interface for that too, that you can conform to. So you know that all the way up in my render thread or process, I can call this C# method with the right interface, and not have to worry about it failing at runtime, at least with that signature, because it all matches up, right, all the way across this pipeline. It's just really, truly remarkable if you think about it, because you have the render process, which its only responsibility is to render the view, right? So you have a view framework on the render process, and the main thread just kind of does all your logic, right? It does the heavy lifting, and then anything you want to send anywhere else, you can do that on the main thread, and then kind of relay that back to the render thread. It's all event-based, right? So, which is pretty cool, because this pattern, has been the same for decades. And now you can use the same kind of system all the way on the desktop using JavaScript. So if you're going to use Electron, the basics are you have a main process and a render process. The main process listens for events, starts the application. You have access to Node APIs there. And the render process is where you want to instantiate your React or Angular application, right? So if I want to demonstrate how this actually works, let's say I have a C# application, right? This is just like a CLI application. It accepts a few arguments and returns some data, right? Really simple command line application, but it has some arguments, right? These 2 arguments, and they need to be integers. So how do you make sure whoever is consuming this application is adhering to the standard? Well, we'll find out. So here's my Electron application in Visual Studio Code. Basically, if you're familiar with how this works, I got my package.json here. And it's a typical package.json. It's got a build script to run Webpack through. It's got dev dependencies. It's got all the types using the new TypeScript to type packages dependencies, right? So I got my Electron types right here. So I'm strongly typing, kind of like with IntelliSense, my Electron app, right? And the configuration, because I have 2 sort of processes, I have a main and a render process. In this case, there's 2 different Webpacks, right? So I got a Webpack for the main, which is I'm using Awesome TypeScript Loader, which is a Webpack plugin to get TypeScript files compiled. So the Webpack configuration is slightly different from the render and main thread, or main process. Something to be aware of if you're writing Electron apps. So if I want to demonstrate this, notice that my main is actually, the entry for that is main/index. So if we go to script, if we go to source, main index, you'll see this is kind of like the entry point of everything. So I've created this app event handler, which is designed to start the application. Notice on init, I'm listening for events that when the application is ready, I create a main window, and which is my index.html. if you go to that index file, you'll notice that it's a very basic HTML page, but I am requiring the render file, which is actually the view, right? So if I go to the render, all it does is call, in this case I'm using React, the React DOM to render an application. And my application, all this does is, it's a React component. If you don't understand React, this may look a little weird to you, but all I'm doing is rendering a table with a list of national parks. Okay. But what's interesting here is that when my component is instantiating, I am calling IPC, which is coming from Electron, and this is just inter-process communication API, where I can kind of like send events and listen to events. So when the component is instantiated, I just send the event to request data, and I'm passing in some arguments, the page and the items per page, and this is kind of like these are the arguments in my command line application, which is 2 arguments, 2 integers, one's the page, one is the limit. And I'm passing this in here with an interface, iData request, okay? This is really simple interface, but just gives you the idea that I'm sending an event and I want to kind of strongly type it, right? Kind of, right? So that actually gets sent down from the render to the main, and the main listens for the request data event, calls child process.get data, and that's essentially calling a node API to call this executable with some events, with some arguments. And once it receives data, convert this to an array of strings, right? So let's compile this, right? I'm going to call my Webpack script, which is npm script, which is just a script to build both the main and render code. And then I'm going to run Electron, right? So that should start building my app with Webpack and also run the Electron shell. And you'll notice I get a table of national parks, right? So all this data came from an executable, but here I am in my desktop application written in JavaScript, and I have all this data, right? So pretty cool, right? And just to prove to you that this is real, I'm going to just change the items per page to 100 and rerun this and see what happens. Okay, so I supposedly got a lot more items. Yeah. Like I think there's like 500 items here or something, so if I change this to 500, I'm doing this live, which is dangerous, but just see what happens. I get a ton of data, and this is all really just streams, like coming from Node all the way up. So yeah, you've got A to Z right here. So this is all the data in my client command line interface right here, right? Just rendering it to a table.
So in your PDX, were you writing out to standard out? You're parsing it?
Yeah, just rendering it out to std out. Right there. It's just at the end of the day, it's really just strings and buffers you're moving around and stuff. So.
You do the same mechanism by connecting to a DLL instead of.
Yeah, you could.
Okay.
You could do that. So something cool I discovered was that there's something called typewriter, which will actually generate TypeScript uh, interfaces and classes from C# code, right, automatically for you. So this is like a templating library. So if you've got a ton of these classes that in like a C# API or application that you want TypeScript to recognize, you can do this automatically using this templating library, which is pretty cool. So you don't have to hand code the contracts between the two. And for more information, there's this really cool GitHub site called Awesome Electron, which gives you a ton of information all the way from like how to configure Electron, how to write installers for it, how to patch it. And this blog, Electron Rocks, I would highly recommend if you want to get into Electron, because the guy talks about a lot of insider stuff about Electron that come handy. So, any questions? Or
so you mentioned Angular or React. Other frameworks, does it really matter?
It doesn't matter because it's really just the view, right? You could write it in plain old JavaScript if you wanted to. Yeah.
The binary, are you packaging the binary with Electron app, or is that just something that is in your path, so it's able to find what you're calling there?
Well, this is Electron is just that's really just
Not
part of.
Electron, but the little simple command line app that you were creating.
Oh, that's just a .NET Core application.
Right.
I'm just
where does the binary live?
So in Webpack, I'm building everything out to like a dist folder right here. So in my dist folder, I just have bin and all my output right there. So I'm really just a local folder, and all my assets are right here. You'll see my main.js, my HTML file, my package.json, which Electron requires a package.json to point to a main entry. It'll read that and then just run everything else. But I'm just calling Electron on that folder, and that's kind of like my local path. I mean, this is not the production way to do things. This is just a demo. All right.
When you try to distribute that Electron, it's not just a single exe. Does it go into, I mean, how's it distributed?
Yeah. So that's a whole another topic for discussion. But if you go to Awesome Electron, there's helpful links on how to write installers for it and how to patch it. There is some sort of there's tools here like Electron Builder that'll let you create installers for Electron. Right.
So is Electron like a Bitcoin wrapper around Node, or is Node required to use Electron? Or?
Electron is actually the Chromium project. It's the Chrome, like built as a desktop application. So you have Node inside. You have V8, right? You have the V8 engine, so you have access to whatever V8 can run, which is Node and everything.
So that's basically my understanding. V8, instead of running a browser, it's running a code.
Yep.
See, writer, is that, I don't know if it uses something at the front end where he's just like sockets to 12 cross channel, or is it some extra thing?
I don't know. It's a good question.
You were saying that IPC is a thing of electrons.
Yeah,
That's how you're talking.
it's really just a Node API. I think so, but yeah. If you go to IPC is from Electron. But really, you can go to the Electron documentation and look at the stuff there, and they talk about everything related to IPC and stuff. I don't know if that's part of like a Node feature or not. I don't know too much about Node to tell you that, but I know in Node, like what you can do is spawn processes and child processes, and that's how you communicate with other other processes, and those become like kind of like additional processes within your main process, right? So that's helpful, like if you want to spawn an API or something, which is what Visual Studio Code does. That's written in Electron, right? So Visual Studio Code does exactly this. It spawns child processes, reads and writes streams between them. So.
Okay. Thank you, Stuart.
Thank you.
Matt, are you here?
I am.
Oh, I'm Matt. I'm James, by the way.
Yeah, I had trouble
Okay.
mapping this person on
Yeah.
here, so.
So we're going to take a short break while we get Matt set up and settled in. So like I said, break room's there, bathrooms are back there. Please make yourself at home. Comfortable. Nice to meet you.
We met at PDX.
Oh yeah.
The PudNeg.
Yeah.
I was talking about your recording. Yeah.
How you been?
Good. How are you, man? Good. Enjoying it.
Are you okay if we record this?
Yeah. Yeah, that's fine. Cool. Man, I was worried about bringing Windows, or I brought both, but I'll use my Mac.
Okay.
It's HDMI good. I'll plug in to.
Power.
I think I got one.
Plenty of power now.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, my friend showed me like some of this thing. It's like, I don't know, just like, had a whole like, together, like, you know, software development,
Water.
build on and like create water.
Thank you.
A lot of, yeah. Show that you're like interested and like learn how skills like problem solving, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So I like to cool things to get into. Still too new, right? We got the PDX, you know, to go learn games and yeah.
Set this on the edge of the table back here.
Perfect. Thank you.
So what do you want?
All right. Let's see if I can get this up. So.
So you
Is there Wi-Fi here, or?
CSG guest is the SSID. And the password is wireless with $ signs instead of S's, all lowercase. Yep.
LE. All right. Thank you.
that's awesome. I think it's, I mean, it's going to depend on the person. I would do one way to solve it. Well, like, I mean, I still gotta like, it's been a while since I've having a good experience. I already know
in the browser.
Or those platforms.
But that was kind of well, to get the better, I agree with that.
Trying to figure out something.
Yeah, yeah, well, have you been running much at the browser?
Well, make more money.
The other end was kind of right there. Right next to
That part works out alright. But I like one of those.
two sides to a very
To me, that's like super exciting.
That's like, if you tell by how you were doing.
Yeah,
I kind of got.
they're always, helping out.
Pretty interesting.
Yeah, I'm not like quite there. That's where I want to get. I want to get to the point where.
Yeah.
But like I have a group of guys that get to make we're all like two of them are managers and the rest of us are already
General's
so it's like really awesome. But I'm
I gotta
tell them, like, actually people. But I really want to be like,
IoT. You talk about those.
Yeah, I guess it's becoming,
So I can't hold
yeah, I tried doing this all day, but then I feel like a month is out. I go really hard.
Trees one key.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, there's a way that you listen to survey.
Yeah.
People comes across.
And it was, I started going to like this program, and like work. It's like
Like a trigger, right? You have one lightning.
Awesome. A lot of time today, and I was just like, yeah, I'm go in there and study, and like, let's see what happens.
Oh.
So we have like, oh, I just have money.
yeah, it's like, definitely.
One thing I wish there was the security aspects. The secure calls, manage non-state privileges. That's the bigger industry standard. Yeah.
Oh, right.
I'm the outreach manager. And
A lot of that.
and I try to get like speakers for like and speak to students about it. And I mostly just control. Is that something like you or you know what to do or like I feel like the students get really hard on street. Interesting. Awesome. Oh, cool. That's something you'd be stoked to do? Oh, do you? No, I haven't made it there yet. It's something you do. Oh, you are? Yeah. Ah, cool. That's awesome.
Yeah, no, I get calls sometimes.
Oh, you do?
That's fine.
Oh, okay. Oh, rad. That'd be awesome. Oh, okay. So then you like, you're real aware of how that all works.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Oh, that's really cool. Like, so, I mean, it's unfortunate that students get like, doesn't quite work for their style. Which is really tough, and like, you feel good about it.
Well, and we some different schools and boot camps will actually use courses as second languages. What they do, right, in class. Now, time,
Yeah, that's really cool. It seems to be, I haven't checked out this out, it seems to be established program.
We're our sixth year. And what's kind of distinguishes our year first group and so we have assumptions about what you so instead of just jumping right in, assume you know what data types are basic.
That's cool. Yeah. Yeah.
You have to weed out all those assumptions that are so easy.
Well, and like, the biggest issue is icing the face on people. And the things that you're super good with, and you're explaining to somebody, you take for granted all the little things that they don't know. And it's really easy to yeah. Cool.
I can go super long, but you keep me. There's so much content. So at least an hour. That's about the shortest I've ever done a talk is an hour. So. Okay.
All right, I might have to.
So you would reach me at my search deck.
I don't use Twitter.
Okay, sure. Church actually, okay.
Okay. All right.
Finally.
Okay.
Perfect. That's awesome.
It was a surprising difference.
I could see that. I feel like it's one of those, like, you know, just like slide. Yeah, just coming up to where everybody thinks it's not common, but then it becomes quite rare. Yeah.
There's at least one problem.
Oh, yeah? Oh,
They would call the household. Ask them for me.
I am.
Okay, we're going to get started with Matt's talk. We're all set up here, so everyone please welcome Matt Duffield, Introduction to Aurelia.
All right, thank you. As you can tell, this is an intro to Aurelia. Just really quick, just who I am. I grew up here in Oregon until I was about 18, 19, and then was in the military. Once I got out of the military, I went to school on the East Coast at Clemson University. So I've been living there. We had kids, and we finally decided, before the roots got too deep, to come back out here where all my family's out here. So I was the leader of the Charlotte Alt.NET user group and the founder of the Charlotte Unity Game Developers group out there. Had a lot of fun doing all that stuff. Microsoft MVP. I primarily work as a software architect. I'm a LinkedIn trainer, and then I've done a lot of books with Pact and Sync Fusion. And then A-Press is, I'm working on a title right now on Aurelia with them. So what are we going to cover? Aurelia, first of all, we're just going to kind of answer the question, what is it? We'll look at some of the other frameworks and just kind of get an idea. Where does it fit? What was Eisenberg's vision when he came up with it? We'll also just quickly go over getting started. There's so many ways to get started that sometimes that can be somewhat intimidating. Like, how do I begin? Luckily, there's the super easy way where you just download a zip, and then there's more progressive. Just depends on how much control you want. We'll create an application. We'll look at existing skeleton navigation if you've played with Aurelia, as well as using the CLI and just go completely from scratch. Within creating the application, we're going to basically either talk or touch all the key components of what makes up Aurelia. And if you're familiar with any of the other front-end frameworks out there, it's pretty much going to be the same semantically. There'll be different implementations. But for the most part, a front-end framework, you have to do certain things in order to build your applications out. We'll talk about debugging your application. If you've played with Angular, really good Chrome extensions with that. We have the same thing within Aurelia. Some really nice tools, even within Aurelia, that we'll talk about, that are custom elements or custom attributes that you can use to further give you visualization. And then, because this is an intro, I'm going to put a bunch of bullets of additional concepts, which I consider maybe not advanced. It just depends on how you approach it, but I want to at least bring them out there, and if we have time, I can skim through them or show you guys some of it. And if there is time, I'll show you Front-End Creator, which is basically a CMS, ERP, CRM tool that allows you to build through drag and drop applications. The original version was done in Angular, and when I switched over, it was probably 70% less code to do it in Aurelia. It was amazing when I first played with it back in February of 2015. But, so it's an ongoing evolution. But for more than anything else, if you guys have questions, interrupt, ask them. My format of actually doing the coding is I want you guys to interact and say, hey, what about this? Or just ask me, and I'll say, that's a great question, let's try it out. There's nothing really canned as far as the code. I just want to be able to show you guys the concepts, and then if there's questions, we can dig deeper into it. Before we get started, what is Aurelia? So even before we even look at these bullet points, Rob Eisenberg, which I'm not sure if you know who he is, but very big in the Microsoft space, has a huge presence from a standpoint of frameworks predating Angular or any of these other frameworks for XAML. So I was, my first designation for, one of my first designations for MVP was Silverlight, and I was a huge proponent for Silverlight. My first co-authoring with Infragistics was building rich enterprise dashboards in Silverlight, which didn't go very far once Apple pulled the plug on plugins. But Eisenberg has always had a presence in building frameworks, and he's been doing it for a very long time. Caliburn, if you guys have ever heard of Caliburn, then Caliburn Micro, which pretty much propelled his business and his career when he gave a talk at Mix, basically calling it Build Your Own MVVM Framework, where he just basically said anyone can basically apply the principle of MVVM due to the nature of how rich XAML is and the context of data context. If you guys remember or know what how XAML works. The same thing applies with Angular, Scope, ng-scope, with Aurelia, with React. We call it different things semantically, but the same thing applies. And he said, you know what? I can even take it further. So he first started out and he used his next framework for JavaScript, used Knockout as the back end or the binding engine, and then it was Durandal for the engine itself. And he says, you know what, because of the nature of ECMAScript 6, 7, some of the new features that are coming out, I can even take it further. And that's where Aurelia back in January of 2015 was introduced to the public. Just a quick note, I'm a huge fan of ES specifications, 6 and 7 or 2015, 2016. I have a book on Sync Fusion called ES6 Succinctly, if you're interested in it. I love it because of the fact that both now with Angular as well, they target web standards. And Angular is more TypeScript focused. Aurelia, you can do both. And so I love both of them. And I love the fact that we can use these great languaging semantics, whether it is pure ES6 or getting in better with TypeScript. So let's take a look at what Aurelia really is. He is has a very strong opinion on how he wants to approach frameworks. These first couple of slides or couple of bullet points are very much Rob. If you ever talk to him, it's going to be clean and unobtrusive. When you look at the code, it should be something that you just look at and you're not embarrassed to look at, and you say, hey, that's actually pretty clean code. Convention over configuration. If you find yourself doing patterns over and over again, he's going to say, you know what, I want to do that 80-20 rule for you. And convention over configuration, view models. If you name your views and your view models the same, there's no marriage, there's no ceremony that you have to do. It just works because of the fact that it tries to apply those conventions. Simple, but not simplistic. And this is probably the thing that's super awesome about how he's designed it. Modular design fits in well with it as well. It's very simple that you can just start out and you can just have a simple Aurelia app without any other modules, without any security, without routing, and just a static page, static spa, that's it, nothing else to it. or you can get as complex as doing nested routes, nested routing, nested layouts is one thing that he calls, and we'll talk about those, nested viewports, going to the ultimate extreme of making this thing uber complex. Easily promoting these ilities, testability, maintainability, extensibility. Because it's so modular, you can just take pieces of it and test those out in isolation without worrying about breaking everything else or doing the wrong thing. He very much is in favor of compartmentalizing or separation of concerns, so that when you're building out your Aurelia application, it automatically follows that model. And if you look at, which we will, the skeleton navigation, you'll see that it's broken apart in how they have testing built right into it, so you can provide you with examples. When we look at the CLI, the same thing applies there, where it's trying to show you how to do best practices. And a lot of what you could do, or how you see projects set up within Angular, John Papa, Dan Walling, you can apply the same thing here with Aurelia of how to set up and do the best practices, because ultimately it's just a folder structure of what you would want to do there. The next thing that he does, in which we've already talked about, is the modular design. This is something that he is very serious about, and he actually has a name for that, which within a modular in Aurelia, you just call those plugins. If you want to author your own plugins, if you will, but you don't want to have to worry about creating a whole nother Git repository and setting it up in NPM and everything like that, you can actually use them in line, and they're called features. So a feature is something that if I'm authoring a bunch of custom elements or custom attributes or things like that, I can author them all as much as I like, use them directly within my application. Once I'm satisfied that they fit all my tests, then I can then promote them as their own repository, as their own repo, and then reference them as a plugin. So it's really nice, because it allows you to continue to move as quickly as possible, instead of having to have that maintenance nightmare of maintaining all these separate repos. First get it working and then push it out and let people know about it. Again, standards focused. This to me is extremely important, just from the standpoint, I don't want to go down a rabbit like I did with Silverlight, or something that isn't standards focused, isn't going to be ubiquitous, isn't going to be on every browser. And so if he were to choose a convention saying, we're going to use ES6, ES7, in addition to TypeScript, but I'm also introducing something that you have to do, and in no negative connotation to Ember, where it's very opinionated, you have to do it the Ember way. He doesn't go down that path. He pretty much says, I'm going to focus on standards. If you write ES6 code, it will work. If you use some of the new ES7 code, it'll work for evergreen browsers for the most part. Otherwise, you can use Babel, TypeScript to transpile that and get it to work with polyfills across the board. For the most part, I think it's IE 9 and above, but really I would say 11 if you really want to have that wide support. And then finally, as you guys are probably already familiar with, one of his first decisions when he was looking at building this out, he was like, you know what? After he announced that Microsoft was talking to him and saying, because you're using ES6 and because TypeScript is so closely related to with ES6, we're just extending it out a little bit more. Have you thought about having the repo support both TypeScript and ECMAScript 6? And immediately jumped on board, as well as the team that's maintaining Aurelia. And so now you'll actually see, when you look at the source code, for the majority, it's all TypeScript now, in that it generates all the documentation and everything like that. But then they also have an ECMAScript 6 version as well. And then if you're curious about Aurelia and you're like, well, where do I look? How do I get help? The most popular channel or to go is on Gitter. There's a Gitter Aurelia channel that you can go to, Stack Overflow, Reddit, but you'll be amazed at how many people are online and are constantly helping. And that's been pretty much the case since the onset of Aurelia. I think that's due to his success with Calibre and Calibre Micro, Durandal, his conventions over configuration. He has these life cycles in these workflows for the way screens should work, how you communicate with them. That's been proven, and he's just been taking them from these other frameworks, as from the XAML space and then JavaScript, and just applying it. So as he's gone, he's matured. And a really good case in point is to some of his design or architecture prowess is the fact that when he was working, when Google brought him on to work with them, it was basically his concept of how the router should work. If you guys have ever done Angular 1X, one of the biggest complaints that we had when we were building Angular apps was the router. And you never used the native router in Angular. You always used, I forgot what it was called, ng router or something, a separate plugin that was far superior than what they originally had. And again, Angular's a great front end. Just they recognized that, they saw that he had a really good vision with Aurelia, and they said, well, you know what, maybe he can help us out there. And if you look at Angular 2 or Angular 4, whatever you want to call it nowadays, since they're going so quickly, at their router, it very much is the same as what Aurelia does. So that's nice. All right. So if you were wanting to get started in using Aurelia, the first couple things that you would need to know is there's a couple dependencies that it has in order for you to get up and running. Number one, it focuses on Node.js 4 and above, npm 3, and then Git. If you wanted to use the Aurelia CLI, you would just do npm install Aurelia G, just to make it global. Or you could just grab one of the skeleton navigations. This route right here, we'll look at the website in a second, pulls down all of their reference implementations of how you would spin up an Aurelia application. So there's TypeScript, there's TypeScript Webpack, there's TypeScript ASP.NET Core, there's ECMAScript 6, ECMAScript 6 Webpack, and then I think there's, we'll look in a second. But it gives you a really good example of those. This is just one of the many applications and Git repositories that are out there that support the infrastructure of what makes Aurelia. When you look at the Git repository and you just do a search on Aurelia, you're going to see probably 30 or 40 actual repositories or applications that they put in there to build around it. It's extremely rich, sometimes daunting, but at the same time, you pick and choose what you want, and that's the beauty of it. And then with editors, Visual Studio Code, Sublime, Atom, Visual Studio, you can use pretty much any editor you want, and configure how you want to do the integration. I like personally just sticking with just a raw editor and nothing with Visual Studio proper. Visual Studio is code. I've been using Sublime for so long that I tend to even stick with that, although code is getting so much more and more superior to where Sublime is, just with how quickly Microsoft has been revving Visual Studio. And the nice thing about it is it's just a JavaScript HTML5 application, which we just learned, using Electron. So let me show you really quick their site. Let's see if I can remember how I got all these things set up. So if you haven't seen the site for Aurelia, I would say it's worth your 4 minutes and 56 seconds to watch just the intro, just to see how simple it is to set up an application using Aurelia. I'm not going to cover a lot of it, but this will give you a really good place just to start. The place, though, that you're going to really live if you're going to be writing applications won't be their website. It's going to be the Doc Hub. In this Doc Hub, everything here was written in Aurelia as well. But you'll see that it kind of gives you a listing of everything that you needed to know about how to set up or how to configure, how to use. And then depending on what you want to click on, maybe like build, the CLI, then you can start going down and taking a look at examples of what you need to do, how you do it in order to get yourself set up. There's a lot of information out here. And again, I would recommend maybe looking at the skeleton navigation while you're playing with it and then trying to understand kind of the semantics. If you are familiar with any frameworks that are already out there, you're going to find that, hey, this does resonate with me as far as patterns that I've already used in the past. So, but I just wanted to show you this site. If we went to GitHub and looked at Aurelia, you're going to see there are a ton of frameworks or repositories that all are related to Aurelia. These are all under the Aurelia branch. There may be other third parties that people have written that Rob hasn't adopted yet because it's maybe just a company or something else. But all of these that you see here, if you did Aurelia dash, that would be the name of the plugin when you did an npm install. So as you can see here, there's a ton of information and things. We'll be playing with the skeleton navigation. But there's a lot of really cool things that we have here. Let's see, what else did I want to show you before we get started? Okay. All right. So when you're getting ready to start and build an Aurelia application, you really have two options. One being using the skeleton navigation, which I should have gone back down to it. You can just go ahead and clone this repository. As you'll see here, you've got ESNix ASP.NET Core, ESNix Webpack, just ESNix with, I think, uses require.js, TypeScript ASP.NET Core, TypeScript Webpack, and then just TypeScript by itself. So by cloning this repository, you get all this infrastructure. You don't get any of the NPM modules or anything like that. So then you would go into each one of these correspondingly and do an NPM install inside of there as well. But it's nice because you can just pull it down, take a look at it. I have an Aurelia folder on my local machine that I keep track of all the versions of these just to see what's different or if there's anything new with what they have within this. I find it even still a great reference for me to go back and look at and say, you know what, value converters, how does he do that? And just kind of look at some of the examples that they have there. One key thing, if you're familiar with XAML, and if you've done it in the past, Eisenberg's framework, especially Aurelia, outside of Calibre and Calibre Micro, since they were XAML frameworks, is very much, in my opinion, a Microsoft framework. It has the same naming conventions. So view model, value converter, just the naming context that he's using when he builds it out makes sense if you've done XAML in the past and you're trying to learn it. And so I found that when I've talked to groups or companies, when we go in and start looking at this, it makes it so much easier for that learning curve if you're trying to understand it and saying, oh yeah, well, we had value converters in WPF. Is it the same in what you're talking about? Exactly the same. So it's pretty awesome how we designed and did it. I'm assuming that he used a lot of what the power of WPF had and just brought that in. The data context he calls binding context. And so just naming conventions that he's used to try to follow when he's building out this JavaScript framework is pretty nice. Downloading and cloning these can take a little bit of time, regardless of whether you do it the Aurelia CLI version or the skeleton navigation. But let's take a look at what we've got here. I'm gonna stop this and we'll just look at the code first. Can you guys see this okay? Again,
So, yeah,
I'm gonna close all these just so that we can. Okay, yeah, I'll bump up the terminal as well. If this code is too small, just holler at me. We can increase it. And yeah, let me get rid of some of this stuff because I was playing with it. Okay. All right, when you first started using Aurelia and you clone the skeleton navigation, you're going to be presented with a set of files regardless of whether it's TypeScript, whether it's ES6, whether it's using Webpack or JSPM, require.js. And this skeleton navigation has this folder structure. We're going to look at both this structure as well as the Aurelia CLI. This one already has routers. It already has kind of everything scaffolded and set up for you just to run it and execute everything. If you were to use the CLI, nothing. It makes no assumptions. It says, okay, you can build it however you want. You can do whatever type of spa you want, but you must do that. So a lot of people start off looking at the skeleton navigation, and then they jump back. So the first thing I want to do is just look at it as if we were studying how it was set up, and the way we kind of begin is just looking at the index.html of how things are set up. There's going to be certain things that are specific to how we are building and bundling our application. This one is a Webpack version. There's System.js or JSPM, as well as require.js. Each of those are going to be handled just a little bit differently based on how that build system works for us. So you'll see certain things that, for like the title, it's going to come in from a Webpack plugin that really has nothing to do with Aurelia. That's just how we're bundling the actual application together. We'll talk about bundling in the future, but so we'll have this. We're going to have specific points in which we're going to get a base URL. That base URL is everything so that Aurelia can either work with hash or without the hash, but basically tells us how to actually interpret the SPA for routing and to be able to handle that. And this is going to be able to tell you, well, just like if you're doing a web API, do I want to have a keyword, custom keyword called maybe API, and then after that, you can do the same thing here. Let me scroll up. The key thing to note when you're talking about an Aurelia application is that somewhere within your index.html, you need to identify and let the index page know that you're in the context of an Aurelia app. To do that, you say Aurelia app, and then you give it a name or an entry point. This basically is saying, hey, I want to create an Aurelia app, and I want it to start at this position in the DOM, and I want it to have the entry point called main. There should be a file here then called main that's associated with that. He's doing, or this sample, Skeleton Navigation does a few extra tricks in that when the application first loads, it's going to show this splash with a containing message. I think it's just like Skeleton Navigation with a spin. And then if we're in, if our environment is development, then it's going to also create this dev server. And that's where you can do browser sync or hot module reload. All of that, you can support that with all the builders that they have. I think the flavor of the week or the month or the quarter or whatever is Webpack right now. It's pretty popular across all the frameworks as far as how you can use it in comparison or contrast to JSPM or even Require.js. There's advantages and disadvantages to all of these, but if you want to bundle and do hot module reload based on routes, you can do that within Aurelia, which is pretty awesome. Okay, so we're basically saying, okay, we're going to identify that there's an application called main. We want to be able to have this so that when it loads, we give kind of a busy indicator. Everything is driven by this HTML Webpack options metadata base URL. Webpack pretty much controls how our dependencies are inserted in here. You don't see any of them there, and so it's kind of magical until you start looking at what happens within Webpack. But let's jump over to main. Yes?
Is there a way to do it without using Webpack?
Yes. You can do Webpack, you can do System.js, which using JSPM, you can use Require.js. There's a lot of...
You have to use some sort of bundle.
Say that again?
You have to use some sort of bundle.
No, you could statically, I mean, if you knew everything that you had, you could statically have and just point to that if you wanted to, and then have it so that it just brings everything in up front. The advantage of bundling through some loading tool like this is that we can progressively load those instead of bringing everything up front. But you could do that. All right, so the first thing that happens when we're getting ready to start up an Aurelia application is that we've got a concept of imports, pretty much the same thing within TypeScript, where we're going to be able to import dependencies. Importing will use these loaders, again, with regard to bundling, but the loaders that allow us to specify whether it's text, whether HTML, JavaScript, CSS. The loaders are smart enough to know how to do it and then where to place them, whether it's on the DOM, whether it's in the head, whether it's something that just goes in memory, with regard to how it handles for these. When we want to be able to reference an actual plugin or module that either is Aurelia specific or something that we've created ourselves, we basically will use the syntax of exporting a class, and then we'll import the specific classes that we've exported from that module here. So we're saying we have a text template loader, a Webpack loader. This text template loader actually I added, so we don't even need that. DOM and then platform. Aurelia is platform agnostic. You can actually run everything within Aurelia server side. So classic ASP, render it on the server and then load it in the client, pre-rendered as well. So there's this whole platform or PAL that allows you to determine, hey, am I going to be client side only or am I client server, and how do I handle for that? It's really nice to be able to do this whole concept of PAL or platform with regard to Phantom.js. So Google, Bing, any of the browsers that are trying to look at your application if you want to have that, because now this is a SPA, if you want to have that so that they can actually find individual pages that really didn't exist until you ran the application, you can do the server-side rendering for it. So it gives you kind of the best of both worlds. We're using Bluebird here in just because we want to configure it so that there's a polyfill if we're using older browsers. And again, you can see that immediately they're using, again, this is ECMAScript 6, but we're using async await. You don't have to do that. You could use strictly promises, but you can tap into that, and the same applies within TypeScript as well. But this code, this main.js, will only happen once, where you're basically configuring it to say, how do I want you to run? If you're going to do the vanilla, everything gets configured manually by itself and allow it to do it, then you just do this one line called standard configuration. You can even turn off development logging so it doesn't echo everything out into the console. I typically leave it on until I'm ready to go to production, but standard configuration will basically wire everything up and tell it how to load. You can look at all the samples within the documentation on the Aurelia docs to do that. If you had any features or plugins, you would reference them here. Like the animator, Aurelia Animator CSS, Aurelia Bulma, that's an open source Aurelia plugin that I created. I was testing, I guess. And then if you wanted to use HTML imports, originally that was part of the spec, W3C spec, that actually got pulled. And so he still has support for it for anybody that still wants to use HTML imports. No longer the case as far as how standards are. So again, this is 2 years old. You know, there are a lot of things that were out there that were kind of, hey, this may be happening, coming down the pipe, have changed, especially with regard to System.js and module loading proper. We export this configure function, and then we basically wait for Aurelia to start. When we tell Aurelia to start, then all we're doing is we're saying, you know what, go ahead and get all these standard configurations, resolve all those dependencies, and then what I want you to do is set root. And what set root means, if you don't put anything in here, it'll always default to the word app, Aurelia app. And it'll look for a file or a JavaScript file called app. Here I'm being explicit saying app, which should now look for app.js. There's several other things that we can do with that, but that's pretty much the convention. So when you start up an Aurelia app, the first thing it does is it looks for the word Aurelia app. You specify what is its main point of entry. And again, the default paradigm semantic that they have is main.js. And then within main.js, you can do this. One key thing to note is when you start working with security, logging infrastructure, you probably will see a lot of people have samples where this is a forking position here where it says, hey, if you're using some sort of cache, have I already been authenticated? If I have, don't go to app, go to main, or go to some page, otherwise go to login. So you'll see something like that where you can actually fork depending on this. I use that a lot within my front-end creator where because it's a visual design and you can drag and drop and build apps, it forces the users to authenticate to be able to do the design, but the byproduct of what they design, I want them to be able to have the ability to share that with anybody, with designers, with artists, and say, hey, check a look at this screen that I just mocked up. Tell me what you think. And that's called a preview route where I have that does not enforce any type of security. All right, so we've looked at how Aurelia gets started. Let's jump really quick to app.html, and I'm going to jump back to my slide just to make sure that I'm at least trying to follow some of this logically. Okay. So in this example, we're going straight to the router, which sometimes may not be the easiest thing to look at, but it's pretty simple in the aspect of how it's set up. So when you have an app or when you have your root, the root has the ability to configure a router. You don't have to. If you remove that function here, it just never calls it and it never assumes you have a router. The way a router works, though, is you have to have something called router view, and this is a custom Aurelia element called router view, and that's how it handles the routes and the routing mechanism. One thing to know is that within a router, you can have a router within a router within a router. So Inception, you can do that the same way here, and I think that was one of the first presentations at the NGConf that when Rob was an employee of Google, that he showed that with Angular. It was like, wow, this is pretty cool. The same thing, you've always had this capability within Aurelia. They have this concept of doing router views, which basically kind of does the SPA. You just set a location within the DOM where you want this. You can also do targeted router views, which we call viewports. You can say, well, I've got the toolbar at the top or the menu bar, I've got a sidebar, and then I've got kind of the main workspace area. I want to be able to affect all three of these with separate routes. You can do that. And there's two ways to do that. One's called layouts, where you can actually, by name, and use this concept called composition. Or you can use viewports within a routed view, and that just means you have a router view and you have a name that's associated with it. So if you guys have looked at web components use the concept of slots, and you can use the default slot with that doesn't have a name or name slots, and that's all part of the W3C standard for web components. The same thing applies here, is that if you want to be able to reference more than one, you can do that. The other thing that you may not be familiar with, or you're like, well, what exactly does this mean, is we can require any custom element that we have authored or that we brought in either as a plugin or as a feature. To be able to bring something in that I want to use, I use the word require from, and then the relative location of where it is in my source. The nice thing about it, even though it's being bundled and being packaged, that path will always stay consistent whether you minify or you don't, whether you're trying to bundle everything into a single bundle or to multiple bundles across. But this is the convention that you would have. So route from navbar.html. If you just did navbar and didn't do the extension, it would try to look for it would try to append JS and try to find a JavaScript. You don't typically do that in the template. You would always, if you wanted to bring in another asset, you would bring that in the view model. This template format that you're seeing here is ES6 templates. So that's one thing that's really nice is the fact is that he's not inventing or he's not introducing anything new outside of the standards. And then once he references this and says, I want you to require this, then he can actually use that custom, we call it a custom element, directive or whatever you want to call it, navbar, and then there are properties off of this that we'll look at in a second. We'll look down here at navbar that allow us to then do binding. So if we go back, what he's saying here is that in nav.html, I want to bring in this navbar custom element. I want to show it on the screen. I want to bind it to this property called router in the context of app, so app.js. And then I want to be able to expose whenever a router gets clicked on, I want to expose that content in this router view. So let's go back and look at this guy here. So we're configuring the router and then we're setting it to the instance of app so that we can actually reference it within code. And we're saying here, number one, you can have dynamic titles, so you could have Aurelia, or if you wanted third parties to put in their own titles. And then we're saying, all right, I want to be able to configure this map. Let me make this wider so you guys see it more. If you see an array for the first entry within that represents route, basically all you're saying is what are all the matches. So you could have welcome, you could have home, any route that you want to get redirected to this name and then this module ID. Because it's an empty string, that we're just defining it as our default route as well. So we're saying if you just go to it without anything after the hash, it's always going to default to this route. Okay. Then we're going to say, well, we got another route called users, has a name, module ID. These do not have to match. This is probably the most important component because this actually tells it which view model to load when that route matches. And then we have child router. As we look further into routes, you'll see that you can actually do wildcards, you can use named routes, you can use parameters within your routes, just like you would with any other framework routing mechanism you can do here. By doing this config.map, passing an array of routes, we're telling it that we have 1, 2, 3 routes that we want to actually see. Going back here, then you'll see that we should expect something called navbar, and then inside there, a router view. Is there something? Okay, yes, yeah.
So each of those nav truths adds that menu item to the nav border?
Excellent question. Yes. So this is again a convention. The beauty of this is that the format of this JSON or this element here that we have, JSON object, you could add anything. You could extend it yourself and add other, so like for security, other things that you want. But yes, so in the nav bar, which we'll look at in a second, it's only going to show us things that have nav equal true. If nav was either omitted or it false, we won't see it in our menu. So let's run that really quick and just take a look at it.
If you have nav false, you don't need to include the time.
Say that again?
If you have nav false, you don't need to include the time unless you switch it.
Yeah, yeah. So there's a lot of advanced samples where you're actually building a route based on the way the person's authenticated or based on the permission set. So if they're allowed to see some financials, but they only can see it read-only, and there may be some other features like sub-routes that they could go to, that may be turned off. So you can actually dynamically configure this at runtime or when it first starts up. So I use both. I always have a default route set, but then based on their credentials or based on where they are in the workflow, I'll be adjusting this. But yeah, it's amazing how much power you have, and yet how simple it is that you can either extend it and really dig this deep hole for yourself and like, oh my goodness, what have I done? Or kind of just follow the vanilla path that they've already done and say, okay, this is enough until you need that extra capabilities. There are a lot of third-party plugins for Aurelia that already handle most of the cases: internationalization, security, OAuth, all the major pieces that you and I would think about when we're building an application for the web is already handled within Aurelia. So when we have this, let's take a look and see what happens when we run this. Let's see, where was I think that's it. I'm going to move this guy over here, just so I want to make sure he stopped too. Good. Okay. All right. So there's several different conventions. When you go to the skeleton navigation, each one of them, based on how you do it, if you're using ASP.NET Core, if you're using Webpack, if you're using JSPM, System.js, or if you're using Require.js, there's different ways that how you run them. But typically, there's two main ways, depending on which one you do it. One is either npm start, and the other one, if you're using the Aurelia CLI, is just AU run. And we'll just take a look and see. So I'm just going to show you npm start. So it's going through here. It's actually bundling everything for us and building it out as we go. All right. And if I refresh this, you're going to see that this thing here was that nav bar. And then we have 1, 2, 3 entries, just like we saw. If I were to try to type in welcome, if I can get my hand on the keyboard, it's going to go to the same place. If I try to do welcome to or something like that, an unknown route, it'll always go to the default route. You can override that. You can have your own security mechanism saying denied access, access denied, saying if I as the router or the author of the routes do not recognize the path that you've given me, I'm going to redirect them, maybe to a login screen or access denied, whatever you want to do. The default convention, again, this is very much a Rob-ism, or how he designed it, is that I'm going to go ahead and handle 80%. So for the most part, if you don't provide a valid route, I'm always going back to the default route. And therefore, I'm mitigating errors. You may not want that. You may want to have something that does something that you want, but this is how it's going to work. Let me show you that nav bar really quick, since we've actually seen it. Well, we haven't seen it in action. Now we've seen it in action. Where, and I don't want to jump into these just yet because I want to show you the code to walk up to them. But let's take a look at this. The first thing that you'll notice here with navbar is that it's just navbar. There's no navbar.js. This is something that Rob has done by convention, in that within MVVM or the infrastructure, if you do not provide a view model, he'll create a view model for you by default. So even though we see navbar here, there is no JavaScript file associated with that. He creates one for you if you do not provide that. And the main premise or impetus behind that is you may be doing a lot of custom, this is called a custom element, a lot of web components that all they are is static HTML or dynamic HTML in that it responds to data binding. There's no behavior behind it, with the exception of maybe hrefs that you're linking or doing things. It's pure style and markup, but it's reusable, right? So you've written it once, you've created these custom elements, and you want to be able to access and reference them. If there's no behavior that happens behind them, no JavaScript that needs to be run, then you can just do an HTML file and you're done, and it'll just work. However, the moment you need to be able to tap into the life cycle of whether or not you can activate, deactivate, attach, deattach, or detach, then you need to provide your own view model. He allows us to do things that are simple, just mark up a menu is a perfect example. There's not a lot of behavior. Anything that goes off of it is an href, which then triggers the router again in the context of another view model. So makes perfect sense. I just wanted to preface that because if you're looking here, you will not see a navbar.js. If you were to see one, it would just be an empty view model, just the export class, navbar, an empty constructor, and that's it. You wouldn't have anything else. So you can provide it, but he'll do it for you based on convention. This example, the skeleton navigation uses Bootstrap. So this example is going to be very much a Bootstrap centric. You don't have to use Bootstrap at all. You can use any CSS library that you want, it doesn't matter. Or no library. You can use Aurelia's UX interface stuff, or and use Bootstrap. I find that most of my clients have such a big pool of developers that are already either sold or bought onto Bootstrap that it makes sense showing this or using it. But it doesn't matter. You can use pure whatever you want. Doesn't matter. So what I really wanted to show you here, though, is as we look at this, there's a couple things that just jump out at you that are really specific. Number one, bindable. At the template level, you can identify anything that you want the template to be bound to from a standpoint of bindings. So we're identifying at this template level, I want to bring in something called a router, and that has to be exposed in the context of its parent. So when we go here, you'll see here that we have router. This router is the same thing that we just, let me have them both up at the same time. This router is the name that we reference here, and we do binding. In Aurelia, binding or data binding, it depends with whether or not you're in a form or not. Again, this is a convention over configuration. If you're outside of a form element, then binding is always one way. So you have bind, you have one way, two way, one time. One time. There's a couple more we'll look at in a second. But by convention, we're saying I only want to respond when the view model updates. You can't update from the view to the view model, if that makes sense. This is one way. But we're exposing it here, just saying there's a router. Then if you just scan through here, this is a lot of just Bootstrap code. We'll come down here, and then we're going to notice something. If you're familiar with ES6 and the template specification, string interpolation, this is exactly it. So there's no new learning curve as far as how to actually do and use Aurelia from a standpoint of string interpolation. So you're going to see here $ curly brace router.title. So it's going to try to off of the router find the title, and that's going to show it here. And then further down, you're going to see repeat for. It's going to do the for of. And again, this is following the convention of ECMAScript 6 when you're the new of syntax follows the same thing, where we're going to say, I'm going to create a variable called row, and it's going to be bound off of this array, which is a property, navigation, which is a property off a router. And then from anything inside this context, in this scope of the LI, I want to access it. So I'm going to say, add a class called active if the row is active, otherwise just make that class empty string. And so this is kind of the convention, and very much what you would think pure JavaScript would look like as well. Yes?
Does the template can only have one object bound to it, or can you have multiple?
You can have as many as you want. Yeah.
So what would that look like there?
Oh, up here?
Yeah.
Then you would say bindable and give it another name.
Okay.
Yeah, and
Multiple bindable attributes.
and the reason why you have it this way is because there's no view model. If you wanted, we'll see the case in a second. If you had a really complex screen where you're binding a lot of things, you're bringing a lot of stuff to get your screen to work properly, you wouldn't do the template level bindable because you would have it in your view model exposed as a bindable property, which is just easier to read because you'll see them all listed. But yes, you can have as many as you want. And it would just be bindable and then another name, whatever you'd want to bring in. Okay, so we're seeing that we're repeating. This is the Aurelia style of looping. In Aurelia, anything that's referencing a property that has a dot from a standpoint of an attribute within an element, an HTML element, is the binding paradigm for Aurelia. So, where do we have any bindings besides? This is interpolation, so this is all just ECMAScript 6. This here is Aurelia. Because I see the dot, I know that we're actually using some form of binding called for, and I know that this is the looping mechanism. This again is just string interpolation, so this is just pure JavaScript, ECMAScript 6. Another string interpolation. Oh, here we go, dot bind. So this again, href, we're binding the href because we're using the dot bind syntax. As we look at forms, we're going to see a little bit more how that paradigm works. But it's pretty nice because you can quickly scan and see where all the bindings are just by looking for the dot of the attribute. You can bind to pretty much any attribute that's out there out of the box.
So is that, whether it's a one-time binding, a one-way binding, or a two-way binding, comes from what type of bindable it is that you're binding?
No. Bindings are always one way unless they're in a form. You can, so again, I could go here, bind, because this isn't inside of a form, I know that it's one way, but I could immediately just say two way here. And that's telling it now. I know I can update it by typing into an input control, or I can update it from the view model. Or I could say, no, this thing only is one time, meaning only set it once. I don't care what happens in the view model, never update the UI, right? So the same thing applies here. His convention is, if you have it in regular HTML markup and you use the word bind, the default convention is it's going to be one way unless it's in a form, because forms pretty much, if people are typing in things, you want it to go back to that view model, right? So two ways is the default. And that's just a convention he did. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to follow that. You can override and write whatever type of binding you want explicitly. It just sometimes makes it easier just to, oh, everything's bind, and you know what? Because I have it in a form, I don't have to worry about that. I'll just leave it bind. But again, if you want to understand it or play with it, you can do whichever. All right. So I think we have a good idea of what that navbar HTML looks like. We have this piece again, which was an excellent question, just because of the fact that we don't have a JavaScript file to identify how we're binding at the top level. Let's look at the users. This welcome screen first. I just want to see if there's anything I haven't seen. Okay. All right, so I'm going to go jump down to this welcome. We'll look at the HTML and then we'll jump into how it's being used. I don't think I have animations turned on, but if you use an AU animate and then to bring in that plugin, it will, I think by default, do sliding right to left as the default animation. So when you're switching, when you're clicking on a different route and it loads it, it'll do that as well out of the box for you. It depends on which plugin. There's a CSS animation, there's a velocity, pretty much anything under the sky that you know that's already available as a library, there's an Aurelia plugin for it. You pick the flavor you like, and then if it's CSS based, change the CSS to do however you want it. But this would be for the AU animate to turn it on, saying, in this template for this section, I want you to go ahead and animate anything that changes within here. Again, string interpolation, straightforward. You're going to see now here we're inside of a form, and we're also again at the form we're saying submit because we have identified the type of button down here, submit, and delegate. So when you're dealing with clicking or adding event listeners, Aurelia has three conventions that you can do. You can do a delegate, which basically is allowing you to add event listener, pass in the selector. Now you have your callback. Okay. You can do trigger, which is going to attach. Let me further qualify. A delegate will bubble everything up to the root of the document when you add that event listener. So it's basically doing an add event listener, and then doing a query selector all, and bubbling everything up to that one handler, and then you pass in the callback to be able to handle for that. If you use a trigger, which the other option here would be trigger, This is less efficient because if you have a screen that's generating a gazillion events that you want to wire into, it's one for one. So for every instance, every element that you're doing that binding, it's creating that handler and a callback for that. That may be what you want or may not be, depending on your scenario. For the most part, we use delegate unless we need that fidelity of trigger, okay? And then if you want something where you want to be able to execute a function that is not immediate when either the page loads or you don't know until a future set of time, you can use something called call, and that allows you to be able to call something on the view model or the calling object in and of itself. Pretty much the three scenarios, though, for handling events are delegate, trigger, call. Delegate and trigger being the most common. So we have, in this form, we're basically saying, hey, whenever anybody triggers the submit button, I want you to call a function in the view model or in my context that I am in here for welcome submit. And then as we go here, we're going to look at our first bindings within form. Value.bind, because it's in form, you can immediately make the assumption it's two-way binding. Okay? So even though they're not saying two-way, because it's inside of a form, that's the Aurelia convention that it does it for you out of the box. You can write two-way, it's not going to hurt anything, but just take and you'll know immediately whether it works or not when you start looking at it. So you have value.bind, first name. This has to be a property off of the view model, welcome, just like this has to be a function that's exposed off of there. Let's see, last name, same thing. These are string interpolation. This is how Rob handles or Aurelia handles value converters. So we use a single pipe to say, I want you to display a property off of the view model called view full name, but before you render it, I want you to apply this value converter called upper. The actual, and this is a convention too, the actual class name is upper value converter, but Rob again makes the assumption if you provide the full name, you can just use the abbreviated upper, again, as long as it matches that naming convention. And then I think that's it. So and then let's look at the JavaScript now.
Value converter is registered globally, or you don't need to require it for that template to use it?
Yes and no. Well, you're jumping ahead, but that's an excellent question. Yes, you can just so he asked if the value converter was registered globally. The reason being is that we didn't see it in the require. Value converters are a little bit different from custom elements or attributes in that you don't need to bring them in. However, if you have them in a separate place, in a separate class, you need to bring them in either through a plugin or a feature. So typically they are global from the standpoint of your application. You don't need to ever require them in. All right, when we're looking at a view model, a proper view model, you're going to just have the syntax of export class, the name, of it. Again, within TypeScript, we would have all the typings as well, definitions within here, but I'm just kind of keeping it as simple as possible just to show you Aurelia first. Heading is a property. So this is the ES7 specification that we're using, and we get for free out of the box. TypeScript and Aurelia via Babel give us to this. You can't actually do this in ES6. Like for Chrome, it would blow up, and even though Chrome supports a lot of ES6 out of the box, doing a property initialization is not valid yet. It's coming down the pipe, but it's not yet there. So transpilation will support that for us, whether it's TypeScript or...
What are you saying is ES7 there?
Okay, so this is actually a property declaration inside of a class for ES6. You can do a property declaration, but you cannot initialize it. ES6 does not know how to interpret that. ES7 does, but not all evergreen browsers have that supported. So if you were trying to run this is native code without doing transpilation, it would blow up and say, I don't know what you're trying to do here. Typically the way around that, if you wanted to do that or handle for that, and again, I'm hoping I'm not confusing more than helping, but so if I created a constructor here and I wanted to initialize, I could just say this.heading and blah, 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 blah. Do the same thing that you're doing here. This is just a shortcut, syntactical sugar. It makes it feel more like C# or some of the other languages that we're familiar with. I personally like it just because it allows me to see everything that's going on without jumping into the constructor. However, not all browsers are supporting it just yet. not that big of a deal. It's part of the ES7 definition. So we will be getting it. And all the transpilers, TypeScript included, support this out of the box. So there's nothing that you need to worry about when dealing with that. But all I'm saying is here, these guys are the top level. They're right off of the view model of welcome. So I know that if in my bindings here, I should have a heading, first name, last name, previous value if I wanted it. I have something called a computed property, or a property that's being defined using getters. Getters are also part of ES6, so you get them for free, getters and setters. The one thing that Aurelia has is you can do something called computed from. If you remember within Angular, if you had a lot of bindings and you did a computed property, the digest cycle, it would fire every single time for that digest cycle, regardless if you had 1 or 100 bindings on there. Every single binding would fire during that digest cycle, which was extremely inefficient, and it got a lot of negative feedback based off of that with the Angular 1X. The same thing could be true if you do a get full name. It doesn't know where these are, therefore it would have to do a full walk of the DOM wherever this guy is referenced in the DOM and do that loop to see, hey, have you changed, have you changed? However, you can change that just by saying computed from, and if you use the computed from decorator, which is another ES7 specification, which we have both in TypeScript and in Babel, you can then say first name, last name, and these are properties off of this class, and now it knows to track it individually, and no longer does it have to walk the whole tree, the AST tree. So
That's very knockouty.
yes, yes. And again, I mean, that's Rob Durando was built on top of Knockout, but it's very nice because it's extremely efficient, extremely efficient. You'll also see that we have this function called submit. And again, pretty much everything off of this view model has to be exposed or is public by means of ES6. And so you can access it without worrying about anything. There's another thing called deactivate. This is something that I really like. I loved it in Calibre Micro, Durando, and now with Aurelia. And you see it in Prism for WPF if you ever used the Patterns and Practices Prism guidance when you're doing extremely large applications. MVVM Lite, so Laurent Bognon has the same thing within his library. A lot of people that built MVVM frameworks followed a convention like this, and this is basically what you would call a life cycle, a screen life cycle. So the common scenario for this is you've got a screen, you've got a data entry form, you navigated to that form, and now they've clicked on a link to say, go to the next screen. Maybe it's a wizard. But the form hasn't been saved. They haven't clicked the save button. What Aurelia will do out of the box for you, if you implement can deactivate, or can activate, if you will, is it'll allow you to put code to check, has this thing changed? If it returns false, then it'll say, you need to hit save, or you can provide whatever message you want, but you need to hit save before we're going to allow you to navigate or route to the next route. It'll cancel that routing request and go back to where you were so you can make that correction. So it's really nice. You get it for free, and it's all part of this whole activation life cycle that Aurelia has. And I mean, it's as old as building frameworks, but it's nice to have it just out of the box. You can use it, or you can completely ignore it and say, no, I'm going to do it my own way. And that's the thing about Aurelia. It's very unobtrusive. It doesn't force you to do anything the Aurelia way unless you want to tap into it and use it, or you can create your own. But basically it's saying if the full name doesn't match the previous value that we created when we actually created the instance of this class, then give us a confirm saying, hey, are you sure you want to do that? And then finally, just like you saw here, we have a class that's called welcome. We're also exposing our value converter. The paradigm for value converter, the convention over configuration is you give it its name, and then you always have the suffix of the word value converter. Custom elements, custom attributes, if you provide the word custom element or custom attribute, that's it. It knows to bring it in, and then you reference it by the prefix up to that. So just a nice convention that you're doing there. And it's just going to do a two-upper. So let's go back and just kind of test what we just looked at from a standpoint of the code. So I'll just change it to maybe Matt Doe. And let me try to move. And I said, hey, wait a second. you just tried navigating away from here. Are you sure you want to do that? Because I just checked to make sure that things were updated. They're not. So, well, I guess I'm going to cancel. Let me go ahead and submit it. Now that I've submitted, it's updated it. And now if I switch to another one, the can deactivate is good. So again, with very little code, or ceremony, if you will, you can add a lot of these features that would take quite a bit of, I mean, have you ever tried to stop the browser from actually navigating to cancel that yourself without some sort of routing plugin or routing infrastructure? That's really complicated code, especially if you want that to work across all browser vendors. So this is a really nice feature, not necessarily that you have to use it, but it makes it really nice from that perspective. All right, let me see. Okay. This doesn't have any. Let's look at one of the others, users. All right, this is just another require. If you look here, there's no HTML, it's just require blur image. We'll see down here a blur image JavaScript. So you can bring in logic as well as you can bring in markup, okay, as well as CSS. We're telling it we want it to animate it. We're going to just do some quick translations here. A repeat for saying I'm looking at this array called users off of this view model user, and I want to create an instance, a variable called user. So anywhere in here where I see the word user, I know that I'm actually trying to bind to it. So user.avatar URL. Okay, so there must be a property called avatar URL. User.login. HTML URL. So just things like that you're going to see that are exposed off of this. If we look at the user really quick, well, view model, we're doing several things here. Number one, Aurelia out of the box supports dependency injection. You don't have to do anything to set it up. And the beauty of it is that anything that you define, and this goes back to how the ES6 module system works, anything that you define with export class automatically will be registered within the dependency injection container. So it's beautiful. You don't have to do any type of configuration. And most modern or most mature DI containers or DI libraries do that as well for you now, right? So it's nothing new. There is, though, this concept of lazy, and that basically is saying don't even inject these dependencies if this route never happens. If I never go to users, I never click on that menu to actually try to load that route, don't even try to pre-inject it and create me an instance of this object called users. So that's nice. Otherwise, it would scan and say, okay, I'm trying to build this, the DOM tree. I see that you have all these navigations. I see that you're referencing these routes. I want to go ahead and pre-cache these for you. That's one thing that's nice is Aurelia will pre-cache your views. So once you render a view, the actual markup, not the content, but the markup because you have binding inside of it, it's set up for you. This is just saying, hey, I know that I'm going to need an HTTP client, but only give it to me if I ever use it, if I'm ever going to it. Another quick example here, again, from a standpoint of how we do dependency injection, you can use this. This is called a decorator to bring it in, or you could do this. And it just depends on which format you like. You can just say static inject an array, and I could just do HTTP client here. So depending on which you feel more comfortable, if you're like I'm not digging that, I want to use a more declarative, or I don't know what the difference is between these two, but I want to use this approach better, then you can do that, and there's no harm that will come to it. A couple things to take in hand though here. This is Aurelia, so this is the fetch client. There's two HTTP services that you can use within Aurelia as far as dealing like with XHR. You've got the new fetch API, and then you've got the traditional HTTP client. So you can bring in either, for this example, they brought in fetch, but you could just say Aurelia HTTP client and bring that in as well, and you could use either one. I doubt you would ever use both of them at the same time, but you could reference them. And again, with ES6, you can do this as well as XHR or something like that. You can name your imports, and this has nothing to do with Aurelia. This is just pure ECMAScript 6. All right, so we've defined it. We're basically telling it what to inject. This name must match how you reference it here or here. However, in the constructor, everything within Aurelia is constructor injection. There is no property injection within Aurelia or JavaScript that I know of. So everything is done via the constructor. You can give it any name you want. The trick being is that the order that you have the inject, so here we're doing HTTP, these orders must match here. I could call it mat, and as long as it's referencing HTTP client and I use it in that context, it's going to work. So if that makes sense, and that does make sense, again, just be careful. You're going to see a lot of mature view models that they have a ton of injections that they're bringing in, and you get that one off or you're one off, like, oh, why is it breaking? Oh, I forgot to put it in the right spot.
The order is what you said.
Yes, the order. Yes, so here, and I'll show you a more complex example in a second, but yeah. So right here we just have one. If I had it in the wrong order, well, if I did this to break, we'll break it. Let me see. Yeah, so it's trying, but it's broken, and we'll look at debugging and how that works, and just to prove that it is working. Oops.
So the constructor, you're giving it a function, a parameter.
I'm giving it an object, so it's basically wrapping it and giving it to me. Now, DI can be extremely complicated or it can be extremely simple. Everything within DI out of the box, and this is a convention over configuration again with Aurelia, is that it's a singleton. So think of it as a service or a factory within Angular. You're bringing in the service, you want it to be used, the exact same service for all the views, all the routes that you go to. You can mark it transient, which means I want this thing to be an instance per call, and you can do that as well, either here or when you bring it in, or you can just say here, and you say, you know what? I don't want you to give me dependency injection. When I do, where's my sum? Oh, I'm on. This is a different screen, but pretend the constructor is not the constructor, but a function. Well, I'll just do it. So do something, and I'm not going to reference it, but I'm going to say let h equal new HTTP client. I can do it myself. The trick here, or the danger here, is that you may not know if this guy has dependencies as well. Nice thing about it is Aurelia has functions or capabilities that you can actually reference the container. So I could go up here to Aurelia framework and comma container, and I could say container resolve, and give me an instance, a brand new instance of the HTTP client. So there's a lot of ways you can get around that. The default convention is going to be a singleton, and you just use that. But anytime you need to go beyond that, you can. And to me, it's fairly painless, depending on how you want to do it, to satisfy that need.
Below you're invoking the get HTTP client as a function. So it isn't.
Yeah.
Like the constructor is get HTTP client, and that's some kind of object.
Yeah, I don't know how they wrote this plugin. I know that it's this one is fetch, but yeah, I see what you're saying. Why? Because it's invoking it there. They're doing something inside there, but it's returning an HTTP. That is the fetch client, if you will. And then from there, you'll see that they configure it. This is something else, because the way that they've done it here is a singleton. Once you configure this, you only have to configure it once, and then for the rest of your application, you have multiple routes. If it's always pointing that same way, web API, you don't have to do anything else and just continue to use it. But that could screw you up if you're injecting that guy and now you need to go to a different endpoint. You're like, oh, and that's where you'd either want to create your own or manually override that. You can override this configure at any time as well. So you have a lot of options here of how you want to do that. They do a fetch, and then this is the async await syntax, or you could do promise base, which would be fetch and then with a response as well.
There's a pattern in JavaScript before classes came about that you could basically call it and say you can use new, or you can just call it as a function, and then you can handle detecting whether or not this was there or not. And then you could create your own this and attach to that. I don't know if if anyone here knows what I'm talking about. It's a common pattern that people used to do before we had classes in the ES.
Yeah, the revealing, one of the common names for revealing module pattern, self-executing self-executing function definition. So yeah, again, I don't know how. I haven't looked at the underlying code that they did to create that, but it would make perfect sense if they were doing something like that.
It was a way to protect you in case someone did use new.
Yep.
Right? If they just called you, you could guarantee you were always going to return new.
All right, so you see now that we've got, this is an array of users, and it's pulling everything in from GitHub, doing all the bindings for us with very little code to actually show. I think we actually had more maybe markup, about the same, to show either one, but very little to actually have a data-driven screen that's actually going to an external endpoint and bringing that back. So, and again, you don't have to do async await. You could use the promise-based. Doesn't matter. Aurelia has, again, going back to this activation lifecycle. The nice thing about this is that when this screen loads, it's going to show. You saw that busy indicator. That busy indicator will run until you actually await and complete all the awaits because you marked this up as async. To do it the promise way, you would just return a promise in here instead, and then once that promise is resolved, then the loading indicator would go away and it would render the screen. But it's nice because it gives you the opportunity to show, hey, I'm loading, and the user doesn't think it's broken and just sitting there waiting. What's wrong with the screen? I see the markup, but there's no data. Oh, now it just magically showed up. So this is another convention that Rob has created, that if you provide a promise or use async await, the routing mechanism will wait, give you a nice overlay, and again, you can override that and put whatever you want, but it's going to give you one for you, and then render it once everything has been satisfied and completed. The key component here is that because this does that, and you are using a promise or you are using async await, don't put a lot of crap code in there that's doing a lot of functionality that you could offset, because that is truly waiting for that router or for that route to be rendered. Okay. All right. Let's see. Where are we? Let's jump to child routers. Okay. So this goes back to the concept of inception. We had an app.html, a router that had the router view, if you remember that, and then every menu at the top here, it rendered it in this area here. But now we have this child router that looks like it has the same menu, which doesn't make sense. And if I click on child router, I get, wait a second, how many times can I do this? I get this. And so it's literally inception, because you can create as many nested routes or routers if you want. You can reference the exact same routing API, which you can kind of see the URL, how it's working. Or within each new router instance, you can completely override it and provide your own routes. And this is where using maybe sidebar, menu bar, whatever you have, or security of controlling that, context menus, things like that you could control based on their credentials or permission sets. But this is kind of cool. If you look at it, you're like, wow, this looks pretty much what I just saw. If we saw in the original instance, this is what it was to render any of the top level menus. Now let's look at the child router. And it's pretty much the same thing, where it's got, again, we're using Bootstrap of the menuing aspect. So we got a submenu where we're showing the navigation, the exact same router right here that were referenced that was in the parent, and then router view. Now, if we go to child router, let's see what we have here. We're just configuring the same routes. I could introduce, if I had another view that I created, I could introduce another view, and it would give me that only on the subroutes, if you will. So pretty powerful to get that type of inception or recursive functionality with very little coding. And the thing I like about it is it's consistent. You don't have, because I'm one level deep now or n number levels deep, I have to do something a little different. It's the exact same paradigm.
What was that doing to your URL? When you were
Oh yeah. So that's the power of it. So now if I were to refresh, it would actually remember this, because it knows that, okay, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 router views. I know how to build that. Yeah, it's extremely awesome. And this, I remember when I first saw this at the NG conference when he was working for Google, I was like, man, because I hated NG router. I mean, it was such a bane to writing applications because it just wasn't powerful enough. And I was like, all right, Rob, you've knocked it out of the stadium of the capability and the power that you can do with it. So that's routing. Dependency injection, we looked at HTTP services. Plugins and features, let's see here. You're going to register all your plugins or your features here, and there's a couple ways you can do it. You could do it right off of here, or you could do it standalone. It's just using Aurelia.use, just like they have here for like HTML imports. Or I could do, I don't know if I have this installed. But I would just, if I were going to do this, and I'm going to jump to another application, more complex one to show you. If I had something called my elements or something, I could, I'm sorry, what am I doing? I would pass a URL to wherever my elements are. The way that you actually create features and plugins is you have an index.js. That index.js is a manifest that references all your custom elements, all your attributes. We'll look at that in a second just to further solidify that. But that's how you would use it. The same thing applies for a plugin like we're using here. Let's see. Okay, yeah, I'm going to jump over to another example. Any other questions? Okay. Yeah. Okay.
We do a quick time check for anyone who might need to leave at 8 or is planning on staying. Kind of where are you at?
I want to just kind of show you a couple more things, and then we can kind of wrap it up there. Again, this is literally the very tip of the iceberg. The thing that attracts me the most, like comparing it to React or to Angular, Vue, any of the new kids in the blocks or the new flavors that people really like, is that it just gets out of your way. It's unobtrusive. There's no the thing that really bothers me about Angular, even in 4, is that you see so many blog articles of how to do something that should just be straightforward. Understanding how to do routing in Angular. You're like, wait a second, it should just be straightforward. Understanding how to create a custom component and knowing the right tips and tricks to get it right. To me, the framework should do that right in the first place and allow you to focus on the business aspect of making money. I mean, that's why I like this framework. I don't mind doing Angular because I have a lot of clients that want that. But whenever I get the choice, I want to pick something that gets out of my way and lets me to build my applications as fast as possible, and is extremely powerful. So to me, that's one of the biggest attractions to it. And I love that it is standards based, so that if I am working within TypeScript, I know that it's just going to work. And there's no nuances or things like that. Oh yeah, I forgot if I'm using this type of factory, I've got to write it this way because of the fact that it just doesn't work any other way. As long as you're using JavaScript or ES6, ES7, it's going to work. If you use TypeScript, it's just going to work. And I think that's an accolade to Rob and the maturity of the framework, is that for the most part, I don't have to do anything special to get it to work. Let me see where my, here we go. So what I want to do here is just kind of show you, oh, you know what, before I do that, let me show you this thing. This is pretty cool. So let me jump back to welcome. And there is if you have a Chrome extensions, Aurelia inspector. This was like the NG, what was the NG's called? NG, was it inspector? I can't remember what they called it. The Chrome extension. Is that? Well, I'll just show it to you. But you can install it, just by installing a regular extension. It's going to show up like this. You're going to think it's broken. Why isn't it enabled, or why don't I see anything? It's a developer extension, so it doesn't really do anything from the view until you actually start debugging. So let me show you what I mean. Oops. Okay. So when I start debugging and start working through this, like, this is great to be able to see the markup and find things, but like, oh, these are just connections. It's using browser sync. Like MVVM with XAML, it would be really nice to be able to see what is my data context. What am I actually binding? Because you may find that you've written a lot of custom elements that have their own view models, but then you have this parent page called welcome. What context is this input in? Is it in the context of my page welcome, or is it in the context of the custom element in of itself? And so the moment I do this and I start looking at it and I think, okay, I'm looking at the DOM, this extension allows you to be able to just start looking at the binding context. So for this page, what I'm looking at in here, and because I don't have any custom elements here, everything is the binding context is the welcome page, but it'll tell me right here and show it to me immediately. It'll show me if I have any custom elements selected or any custom attributes, which is really nice. as a learning tool, if you're trying to figure out what is actually going on here from a standpoint of how is Aurelia really working? How can I actually visualize this? Or if you have a binding, and I'm looking at this value.bind first name, why is that not coming up? Maybe it's broken. Let's actually break it. Let me show you what I mean, because this is really phenomenal from a standpoint of the whole learning curve. So let me put first names. Oh, I stopped it. Sorry about that. All right. It's now blank. And I'm like, I know I've got this value about binds right. I could swear. And then you look at your binding context and you're like, oh, wait a second. There's no S at the end. So just little things like that that'll really help you instead of spinning your wheels, especially when you're dealing with JavaScript. Even with TypeScript, it could be painful with your bindings because it's just a string in the HTML that you could just spend hours trying to find out why isn't it working when ultimately all it was is I fat fingered the name. And it would if I had custom elements or I had nesting. Right now, there's only this top level here. So, but you'll see that it can get pretty complicated and complex depending on where you are in the DOM. Yeah, as you walk the DOM, this thing responds to what context is it in. So if you remember in MVVM or XAML, Silverlight had it, WPF didn't, which is the thing that I just thought so crazy Microsoft would do this, just because we were such a smaller group. But it was much more powerful. You could actually put breakpoints on your bindings in your XAML. You never could do that in WPF. And it was like, what? And you could see your data, it was called data context, but here we call it binding context. But extremely powerful. So again, more than anything else, just make a footnote, Aurelia Inspector. If you're using Chrome, it's going to be your best friend. However, if you're not using Chrome, let's see if we can still get around that. So I'm gonna just kind of go back over here to styles to pretend I don't have it installed, or I can disable it. But for right now, we'll just do that. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say, you know what? I know I'm in welcome, and I really want to be able to view into this to this data content, this binding context. Can you show me what's going on here? Ooh. Spine. Let's try this.
You don't have to recompile it.
It should have recompiled when I saved. That's weird. View spy. Let me try it here. I just tested this on a different project, so I know it works for mine, but yeah. I'm not sure why it's not on. I'll show you. Let me show you another project anyways, because I want to show some of these more advanced features. Yeah. Okay. Before I jump into that code, let me just, is that large enough? Let's just make it really big. Okay. We've already talked about this. You have value converters. You have the ability to do something called compose. And all that means is that instead of using routes, you may want to be able to build a complex view or representation that's just raw HTML, a file that's out there that's HTML, or HTML with JavaScript. You can use compose to build these instead of just like view direct, because that's kind of what a route is. It just says, hey, I'm going to this route, show me this. Inside that view, then you could do compose to render other things within inside of that. So it gives you a lot of flexibility. You have something called view strategy. I use that almost explicitly within my front-end creator. Why I do that is I don't have any HTML or JavaScript in my engine. It's cloud-based. And so when developers drag and drop and start building out their applications, I'm actually storing all the markup in document DB as JSON. And then when I render it, because I don't want to have a loader actually look for a file that was bundled called something HTML, something JavaScript, I use this view strategy. The view strategy allows me to inject any dynamic HTML that I want for the markup. You could do the same. You can do the same thing in Aurelia and Angular as well, and I've written it in both. Binding behaviors, you can do things like if show.bind, show.bind. What that means is like ngIf, show it or don't show it based on these credentials. Show it if you have specific security settings. Don't show it. There's things like that you could write your own behaviors. You have out of the box a few if, show, I don't know all of them, but that you get for free. But then you can override and write your own if you want. And these all have the same. So value converter would be the naming convention suffix. Binding behavior would be the naming convention as you author these, and by convention it'll just pick those up. The router, you have layouts, viewports, pipelines, which is for security, that you can inject pipelines before it actually renders to do certain things, enforcing security. Animation, which we talked about. You have this concept of a view lifecycle, which is your view and your view model, as well as a component lifecycle, which are the elements the web components that you're creating have their own, when they get attached to the DOM, when they get detached to the DOM, when they get created, when they actually have the binding context set on them. All these are exposed, and you can do specific things that you want with regard to those. Security, again, where you can inject via pipelines, enforce that using OAuth or Aurelia auth. Testing, your unit testing using Jasmine or whatever. It pretty much is following the same thing that Angular does with Protractor and the in-unit testing that you have. And then deployment, building, bundling, and minification, depending on which one you're using. So if you're using Webpack, it pretty much bundles every single time. So when you do npm start, you actually have a bundle. I don't know why this thing thinks so. You actually have a bundle already out of the box, and in here, and called distribution. You'll see that it just creates these weird bundles, but everything is set up here that literally, if you wanted to use this Aurelia bundle, app bundle, there it is. Nothing's minified, nothing's hidden or anything like that. You can do npm start build :production, and that'll actually minify it and make it so that it's obfuscated, so that if you're worried about people just grabbing your IP, you could do that. This has basically two bundles where you've got an Aurelia bundle and an app bundle. You can create as many as you want depending on the bundler. So whether or not you're using JSPM, System.js, Webpack, Require.js, each one has its own nuance, if you will, but it's extremely powerful from that perspective. And the nice thing about that is you would just literally take this distribution, it has the index already embedded in it, and just deploy it. The Aurelia CLI is slightly different, but in my opinion, it's a little bit more flexible because you can do a lot more things with it. Let me show you a quick example of an application that has a lot more from a standpoint of some of these other features. Let's see here. There we go. Did I stop the other one? No. All right. This is going to use AU run. You'll see when you use the Aurelia CLI, you get this Aurelia project, and it'll out of the box give you like dev, production, default environments, but you can extend it out as many environments as you want to do. You have these things called generators, so you could say AU new view, and it'll actually scaffold you an HTML file, AU new view model, AU new custom element, and it'll scaffold you pretty much scaffolding that you had within traditional ASP.NET MVC scaffolding, the same thing you have here. So, pretty nice. Then you have tasks. This all sits on top of Gulp.js, so you can extend out the tasks to do, well, I want to not only do minification bundling, but I also want you to do a copy of all these assets and put them in a specific folder, things like that, or post build to now not only copy it from where it is in its scripts folder, but out to a publish folder or something like that. So, and then Aurelia JSON is basically for the Aurelia CLI. This tells it how to actually work. So it's kind of like your node specification, but it's actually the bundling manifest of how everything works. But let me okay, so it's running. So let's just take a look at what you can do with this. And let me see if I can remember. I think that's actually all right. So with this, I'm using, well, let me show you some screens. I'm using some markup here that allows me to load all these screens. Well, I'll show you the project in a second. None of these screens are stored in my file. All this markup is actually stored as JSON up in a server. So as I go here, it's actually pulling data as well from the server, from the cloud. I'm using an ACE editor to allow me to do markup and change things. So just to give you kind of a case in point, this site that I'm running has a lot of nice styles and things like that that I can play with. I'm using CSS variables, which you can use now in every Evergreen browser. If you've never played with that, it's pretty awesome. If you don't want to use Sass or less, you can just use variables now in any browser, Edge included. So let's say I wanted to do, I can't remember which one this is, but maybe a button. This is colors. Yeah, let's just say green or something. Just to giggle. And then I'm going to save it. So this is actually saving up in the cloud, even though I'm running local. I've got an instance in the cloud. And then if I refresh this, somewhere I should get green. There. So that's the cool thing about it, is I can actually, even though I have no, this is a styles screen. Let me see if I can find, let me just move this guy over so it's easier to correlate. If you look at my project here, I have, I'll collapse this. I have resources, and this is how Aurelia CLI sets things up, is you have something called resources. All of your attributes, your binding behaviors. This is my drag and drop designer. Dynamic is a dynamic view model. I can render any HTML using that aspect, and then custom elements. So my ACE editor, I have a data form dialog, all these things that I have to support me. But I have basically a client app.js, an app.html, and login.html. Nothing else actually corresponds to what I'm rendering here, because all that gets loaded, and I'm using this view strategy. You can do the same thing in Angular. It's a little bit harder, a little more convoluted, but you can do it. And that's the thing that I really love about it, is that I can actually then go here and play and scaffold, change things out, and say, you know what, green is just not me. What's a good color with red? I don't know. Blue, dark blue. I don't know. But just save, refresh, and I can come back to it and take a look at it and say, okay, hey, that's not bad, or no, I don't like that at all. This is V2, so I'm not done with version 2 of the designer. If I go back here, this is your workflow, so you would have to authenticate. This is using pipes within the router, so it's forcing it. It has in the main.js some forks, which I'll show you in a second. I have the concept of you can have federated apps, so you could be a company that sells or builds websites for other companies. So you federate, you could have as many databases, if you will, or solutions within projects. And then you have kind of
How are you doing the federation?
How am I federating that?
Yeah.
Just logically have separate databases for them so that they can, well, let me show you. So once I authenticate, it goes back and there's a security database. That security database generates a manifest of all the databases that they have registered with their account, and they show up here. So I have 3 that I have when I log in, called front-end master, front-end creator, and then quote 1. But you could do as many as you want. That part is actually pretty easy because that's just data driven, right? If you think about how you're doing federation, the routing then is drilled off of which one you're actually in the context of. So I'm not allowing you to context switch once you're running the application. You're always in the context of one of those solutions. And if you needed to go and work on another client, if you will, then you would log in as that client. So coming in here, I have the ability. So this is something that I think is pretty cool. I wrote my own query manager, which we were talking about security. So I could say front end creator security user dash profiles. Oops, I spelled it wrong. I get all these users. I say, you know what, I want to just look at one of these users. And boom, this is the users, these are the routes that Aurelia uses in order to use that. I can modify and change them at any point in time, save it, and now they've been updated. So, but that's just these are admin tools that I've written for myself using my own designer. But I wanted to just show you the capability of doing metadata from the standpoint of building out new screens. So let me go to tutorial and do random users. This is a pretty cool screen. Actually, probably not the best one because I want to use some data forms. I'm in the middle of going to the next version, so it's really slow because I have some new stuff that I was trying to add. So when you come in, you have the ability to drag anything here and just drop it. Anything that you click on, there's a dynamic properties grid. Again, this is context switching. I've done it in Angular as well. I actually did it in Knockout back in the day, as well as in Silverlight.
Aurelia app builder built with Aurelia.
Yes, yeah. But because this is metadata driven, I can target Angular. I've targeted Knockout and Angular. I could target other front ends because it's just JSON. When I actually store this in the database, I'm storing JSON, and I create this markup. So this markup is actually when I'm drag and dropping, I'm storing it as JSON, and then I render this back out so that you can. It's template driven, so you can override the templates for yourself. But what I really wanted to show is that you have the ability to, with Aurelia, with Angular, with any of these, do some really awesome markup that you're kind of using all of the features in and of themselves, and having some really cool responses, and things like that you could do. If I wanted to preview I was talking about before when I opened up Aurelia, I had to authenticate. Well, this is a custom route that I wrote that says authentication is off because I want to be able to give the developers the ability to share their screens and just send a link saying, hey, check out my new screen. It has a URL, they click on it, and it just renders for them from frontendcreator.com. But long story short, there's a lot of things that you can do in here vis-a-vis communication. So there's an event aggregation. You have the same concept like a message bus within the other frameworks that you can communicate completely asynchronously.
Are you planning on open sourcing this or is it commercial?
I made the 1x of Angular, but this one I've already made a commercial. I have paying clients right now that are using it, even though it's still in an alpha stage. But to me it's been fun just because of the fact that it allows you to do a lot of really cool things. You can inject your own JavaScript, if you will. There's a marketplace that you can go to that allows you to then find, for example, marketplace. I could do a search on script, and I could say, you know what, I want to preview this, if it'll work. Again, a lot of these things I'm in the process of changing. So you can actually preview this, and then you just click this button to download it, and it would download it into the project that you select. So if I click this, it's saying cloning asset clone. So again, it just brought it straight down for you. Things like this you can do out of the box within it, but more than anything else is just trying to show you guys, not only for Aurelia, because this is just metadata driven, and it's just DOM, right? At the end of the day, that's all you're doing. It's how you actually do your bindings, but that's actually very minimal when you think about a lot of things. A lot of the capabilities are just services, which are just ES6 classes or TypeScript classes, completely agnostic to the front-end library that you're using. And I think that's what's really cool. And then if you use traditional event handling with the add event listener within the DOM, outside of either Aurelia or Angular, then you can handle a lot of these things from a standpoint of dragging and dropping or doing other things that you would want to do within here. But more than anything else, I just wanted to kind of show you some of the capabilities, like within main.js. I have, and yeah, I'm in the middle of going to 2.0.
We're going to.
Yeah, I know we're going way off target. So, any questions as far as? All right. Well, I'll make these slides available. Really look forward to hearing you guys if you guys start working on it or have any other questions. I really find Aurelia to be extremely powerful. A great framework, just like any of the others out there. But to me, the biggest thing is just that, time to market and just being unobtrusive, getting out of your way. So, all right, thanks a lot.
Cool. I'll be posting the April hopefully sometime this week, so just keep an eye out for that. See you again. All right, thank you all. Actually, don't work.
Oh, you don't.
I used to. About a year and a half.
Longer than I thought.
Yeah.
I liked your presentation.
We're watching.
Listen.
So yeah, consultants for hire, they'll do it on a project.
Yeah.